Thank you everyone who's jumped on for today's session. We are really excited to have a great sort of robust discussion about the topic of outcomes versus hours worked. And I know for a lot of the panelists who you'll officially meet in just a moment, but also for a lot of the attendees here today, I'm assuming you're all probably sitting on the outcomes side of this argument. So I know that it's something we'll struggle to debate, or if you do want to sort of debate with us for the hours worked, you're more than welcome to get involved in the chat or even join the conversation a bit later. But today we just wanted to have a really in-depth discussion, and I'll talk a little bit more about why we're talking about that in just a moment. As Claudia mentioned, and as you can tell as you're starting to join, we couldn't pass up the opportunity to inject a bit of Star Wars theming into today's session, being May the 4th, official Star Wars Day on the calendar. I am not necessarily a huge Star Wars fan myself, although it may look like it, but I did sort of jump on the Mandalorian bandwagon just because I couldn't resist the cuteness of Grogu, aka Baby Yoda. So that's why I'm repping this today. And I wanted to sort of, if we can sort of tie in the Star Wars theming a little bit more, I was having a look through some Star Wars related quotes related to leadership, bringing in a bit of that sort of Yoda wisdom. And one of the things that Yoda did once say, I believe, is that you must unlearn what you have learned. And I think for us on the call here today, we've probably already done that unlearning piece ourselves, but I think we may need to take some of that knowledge and take some of that unlearning that we've already done and see how we can make some change around, the way that leadership thinks about this, and of course the broader organizations that you're working within as well. So let's stay active in the chat today. We'll ask you a few questions in the chat throughout. Please feel free to jump in and share perspectives from your own organization, which may be really helpful for other people on today's session as well. And then later on, if we have an opportunity for some more sort of open Q&A, let's jump in and do some of that as well. Before we get into the actual content of today's session, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this online session is being hosted. I'm participating from the Central Coast of New South Wales, Australia, so I want to acknowledge the Darkinjung people, and I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of where all of our participants are located today as well. Also to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are present on today's session as well. We have a bit of a rough agenda for today, but for a lot of what we'll be talking to is going to be this really great discussion around this outcomes versus hours worked sort of debate topic. And we'll get into a bit of a problem statement and talk about some of the challenges that organisations are facing in just a moment. So we'll do a few quick welcomes and introductions. So I'll sort of call out the people who are joining our esteemed panel today. We're going to run a quick poll question just to get a bit of a current state of play for all of those who are dialed in for today's session, and understanding what the current focuses are in your own organisation and maybe how you're looking to change things at the moment as well. Then we'll go into our panel discussion, and of course I mentioned we'll have a bit of Q&A and a bit of discussion as well. Please keep the chat active where we can. So for our presenters and panelists today, we have Claudia from Engage Squared, we've got Carly from Microsoft and Laurie from SWOOP Analytics. My name's Emily and I'm also from SWOOP, and I'm super excited to be sort of facilitating today's discussion. But we've got some really great sort of experts, or not sort of experts, they are the experts to talk on this topic. So really excited to learn more from them and really deep dive into this topic in just a moment. So if I can get you to grab your nearest device, and you can just use the QR code to access a few quick poll questions, which will hopefully get you to start thinking a little bit about what the leadership focus is in your organisation, and also we'll sort of do a little bit of brainstorming and a few sort of word cloud type questions as well. So I'll give you just a moment. So the QR code is probably the quickest way, or you can just open up a browser and head to menti.com, and there's a code there that you can use to access the Menti poll. I'll head over to the Menti in just a moment. You'll still be able to see that code and how to access it. So if you're not quite there yet, just a few more seconds, and I'm sure I'll see you all jumping in there in just a moment. So I'm just going to, jump across into that right now. And we have some results coming in, which is great to see, which means we're not having any technical issues. So the first question being, is your organisation more focused on hours worked or outcomes? Of course, I had to have Yoda up against the I guess our preference, and then you're probably going to hate me, but I don't know the name of the guy on the right, but I know he's the evil one. So that's where we're sitting for hours worked. It's great to see that there is a bit more of a focus on outcomes at the moment, but it seems we do still have a pretty decent proportion of people here today who seem to still have this hours worked focus in their companies at the moment. So hopefully for today, we're going to arm you with the data and the insights from the experts to help you have that conversation in your organisation after today. So this will be a really great starting point for you. Jumping into our next question, which should pop up on your device automatically. How are you measuring outcomes in your organisation? And this is just a sort of free field. You can sort of just start to type in your answers and they'll pop up on the screen here. I think it should all just sort of come up anonymously with what you're sharing, so it's a safe space. How are you measuring outcomes in your organisation at the moment? Key results, revenue, with difficulty. Okay, hopefully we have some insights for that today. We measure impact, how you have made an impact on others, built on others' work. Customer satisfaction, that's also a really interesting one. Feedback from senior leaders, business goals, meeting agreed deliverables, impact, and I think it should be, I thought, oh no, there we go, I can scroll through that myself. How we've achieved the goals of the project without going over budget. So, you know, that revenue sort of cost sort of focus seems to be a recurring theme there, and also strategic outcomes. So that's interesting for us to have as we sort of head into more of the discussion portion of today. And we have one final question here, because we did have quite a few of you who are already, you know, have that outcomes focused in your organisation. We also want to hear a little bit about what initiatives have you implemented to support flexible working in your organisation, and that might be really big initiatives or it could be really small. So what are some of those maybe more tactical things that have been implemented in your organisation? And I know we've got quite a few people from Engage Square joining us today. I'm sure you have some really great things that are happening for you at the moment. Hybrid working. This is just sort of, again, another word cloud option. So feel free to, I think you might be able to submit maybe 3 or so options. So if you're still following along on the Menti poll, perhaps we'll get a few other options popping up on the screen in just a moment. I'll give you a minute. Remote working by default, team agreements, that's a good one. Supportive technology, remote asynchronous. Look, we can also share some of the results from these polls as well with you afterwards. So if any of these sort of word cloud type quick initiatives up on the screen are of interest or something, then you can refer back to this after. We'll also make sure we share a recording from today's conversation. And we've got a few odd slides, but I think the real value that you'll get out of today is listening into the discussion with our panelists. Reliable technology, analytics, work from home, hub sites. Awesome. Thank you to those who had jumped into that Menti poll and provided a few insights. I think that will also be interesting for us to guide today's discussion. So I think I might, at this stage, I'll unshare my screen so we can start to bring in some of our panelists and we'll kick off a bit of a discussion. So today we wanted to start with a bit of a problem statement and sort of really have a look at the challenges that are being faced at the moment. So most organizational cultures, we know, have focused historically on time spent physically in the office. And while most organizations have well-established in-person cultural norms, which includes, having a clear understanding of what is and what isn't okay in the office, this doesn't seem to be the case in the virtual world. So the broad question that we're wanting to sort of tackle in today's discussion is, how can organizations establish new cultural norms to help employees feel more empowered about how, when, and where they work? And as I mentioned before, the panelists today aren't necessarily debating this question, because we all definitely fall more so on that sort of outcomes focused side, and that's where we would love to see organizations heading. The goal for today is more so to arm you with that knowledge you need to take back and have that debate within your organisation. And we've got a few sort of key topics that we'll be drilling down on today. So at a high level, we want to talk about what customers are telling us and what customers are telling those on the panel. We want to deep dive into some global trends as well and look at some real data to see what's happening. Then SWOOP's also been running some benchmarking around M365. So I know that there's some insights we'd like to have a bit of a chat about as well. And then towards the end of today's session, we want to sort of go into more of those practical tips to sort of leave you with something to take away from today's session as well. So without further ado, let's get started. We'll bring in our panelists. Carly, Laurie, Claudia, thank you so much for providing your wisdom on today's session. Claudia, I want to maybe start with you, because I know you talk to customers every single day. What are the challenges that they are facing today?
It is an interesting landscape at the moment, for sure. I think most of our clients have biannual or annual pulse survey that they're sending out to their staff. And a lot of them are seeing changes in the types of challenges and problems that people are reporting they need help with. I think broadly, in terms of the challenges we're talking about with our customers, there's probably three main themes. The first one is having access to the right tools and feeling confident using those tools. So obviously in 2020 and even part of 2021, people's immediate challenge was needing access to the right tools to collaborate in a remote setting. Most organizations now have this. They're using things like Microsoft Teams, they're getting rid of legacy tools, and they're working to better integrate common systems, which is all great and a big tick. But people are telling tech teams that the job's not done. It's not good enough to just turn it on and walk away. People are needing more guidance on how to use those tools effectively and also in consistent ways. For example, just yesterday, I was in a workshop with a client talking almost on exactly this topic, and someone said that people don't understand, or they're not even aware that you can hover over someone's status in Teams to see if they're busy or in a meeting or in a call. So quite often for this particular organisation, people will be on calls on a meeting and will be receiving calls from other people, which is just nuts, because they just don't have that simple understanding of how to use the technology properly. So there's all of these bad habits that people are using within the virtual space, which is really having negative effects on people's productivity and also their sense of well-being. So what this means is that technology teams really do need to listen to what employees want and need, perhaps probably more than ever. So it's really not enough to just turn on the tech and walk away. Organizations really are in the thick of establishing new cultural norms, and technology is a huge part of that equation. So it's really critical that people within organizations understand how to proficiently use what they have. It's not necessarily about introducing new collaboration tools, because things like Microsoft Teams is more than enough to support that. It's about being confident and helping your people become experts in what's already there so that they can make use of the technology. The second trend that we're seeing with our clients is that there's this unspoken rules and these unspoken cultural norms for virtual collaboration that just really aren't set. They're just not there. They're telling us that Pre-COVID, when everyone was in the office, they did have really established ways of working. Those unspoken rules were really clear and the culture was really set, but they're just not seeing that in the virtual space. So that means that people are behaving in lots of different ways. Some people are really thriving in remote work, and high-performing teams where perhaps they're a bit more proficient in the technology aren't really seeing a lot of this. But for the majority of people, they're struggling because they're stuck in too many meetings. They're trying to keep up with the barrage of Teams chats and messages and emails, which means they're working longer hours. So because there's no consistent work practices and no clear etiquette, that's really harming productivity for a lot of people. We especially see that when it comes to informal things that we do every day at work. So status calls, one-on-ones with managers, informal team check-ins, those types of things. A lot of our clients are telling us that they're the biggest pain point, because it feels like those are the calls or the scenarios where there just isn't really any structure. Whereas more formal things like, for example, executive meetings or board meetings and things like that have quite formalized structures that are followed. So there is meeting minutes captured, there is follow-up on activities, there is accountability, but that's just not trickling down to the kind of daily activities that people are doing. So people are kind of stuck in this perpetual loop, if you will, because they're just constantly in meetings that don't really have any value, which is a real shame. And then third, people are feeling pressure from leaders to be always on. So it's really interesting that even though leaders aren't necessarily expecting that of their staff, and are certainly not telling their staff that they have to respond to a message at 10 p.m. at night, people are feeling that. So clients are telling us that their managers are, kind of setting that always on mentality. They haven't set any common work practices with their teams, so people are just following the behaviours that their managers set. So that's another really big challenge and pressure point for a lot of organisations that we're talking to today. So while people are kind of keen to keep remote work, there's clearly a multitude of challenges that need to be addressed for it to stay sustainable in the future.
Thanks, Claudia. So you mentioned there around this pressure from leaders as well, and I was wondering if you could maybe at a high level even sort of talk to us about why leaders should focus on outcomes over hours worked. What is the why here?
Because it works. There's so much research to back up the fact that focusing on outcomes versus hours worked, and obviously it's different for every organisation, right? Even in the chat, like if you work in a consultancy, obviously you have to measure hours. That is an important measure for a consultancy, but it's certainly not the only measure. A lot of organisations have implemented policies like moving down to 4 days, but keeping salaries the same as full-time. And that's having huge benefits for employee sentiment, retention, and also, most importantly, outcomes too. The other reason why is because there's no guarantee that just because someone's sitting at their desk that they're actually productive and working on meaningful things. So even with the challenges I mentioned before, we're hearing, a lot of staff are stuck in that perpetual loop of busy work. So it's usually low quality things that aren't actually contributing to the bottom line or the broader company vision. So time is really only one kind of tiny measure in that much larger equation. Time's also really precious. So if you're really considered as a leader on how you plan your objectives for your business and what role your people play in that, you'll naturally start to gravitate towards measuring outcomes. A really big part of that as well is having trust and trusting that your employees will do the right thing. At the end of the day, we're all adults. So if you treat people like adults, surprisingly, they will act like them. And, you bring them on that journey with you as well. So you want to make sure that leaders really focus on, well, what are our objectives and how do we communicate that really clearly to staff so that we're now tracking outcomes rather than measures like hours worked, which don't provide lots of meaning or context.
I think just to add to your point there, Claudia, if you think about things like the 4-day week is being super careful about everybody sticking to that 4-day week, maybe having that everybody is on that 4-day week. I think 2 points here. One point would be towards all those working parents out there who've gone, or all those people who've gone part-time, who feel like they've worked 5 days in the space of 4 to cover that type of thing. So looking at that. But I think the other thing is, the permission that we don't give ourselves, particularly what we've been seeing here at Microsoft is that whole idea of having to give everybody a day off together so that everybody actually has a day off, rather than, hey, I'm having a day off, but I'm actually monitoring, and I'll just hop on this meeting, and so you don't really get that time to switch off. I mean, a perfect example is the team that I work a part of. I work as part of an Asia team, and there's half the team are from Japan. And they have, that is a very entrenched culture about, I can't take a day off if my boss is not taking a day off. I've always got to be on. And so what they've started doing over years is starting to have Golden Week, which is what they've just been having, or what they're currently having, where everybody has the same time off, so that, whether it be customers, whether it be people, your own organization, everybody's got that time off together in terms of the corporate world, so that they can actually, everybody stop and disconnect. And there's no kind of like, I really, what am I missing out on? The 3 weeks worth of emails that I've just missed out on because I've gone on leave, I feel guilty and then can't catch up, and all of that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah.
So we just need to, I think, understanding. So actually my point to all of that is really understanding the insights, right? Thinking about how people are collaborating in terms of, are they working extended hours? Are they respecting people's time off? Things like that, to really be conscious of, to encourage that. So if we do say, a meeting free Friday, you don't want your manager kind of booking in meetings and disregarding that culture that we're putting down.
Yeah, it's I'm glad we've been able to sort of establish what those challenges are right now, and some of those real life examples as well of how that's sort of come to life in organizations. But I'm also interested to hear a little bit more about what the research is telling us if we take a bit more of a step back. So Carly, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that research when it comes to the focusing on outcomes instead of hours worked.
Yeah, sure. And I apologise for anybody who's joined the call from using an accessible technology. I wanted to just describe myself to start with. So I'm of Australian descent. I've got a brown bob. I've got clear glasses on, a grey shirt in my bedroom here in Melbourne, and I do have a fantabulous headband with a whole bunch of Death Star Death Stars all over my headband, like in a big sculpture wise. So hopefully that gives you some visuals to understand and connect me to what I look like. So I think, the research that we released recently, so every year Microsoft releases the Work Trend Index report, which is a fabulous report and a lot of investigation from a global perspective in terms of the trends that we're seeing out there in the market. And this year we've kind of come up with sort of the five key points, and I think a lot of that kind of relates back to kind of what we're talking about, but also to Claudia's points before. I think the key point to start with is really that employees have a new worth it equation, right? So if you are requiring me hours worked and or that presentee kind of culture, and you don't necessarily need it, as Sally mentioned in the chat, like from a frontline worker perspective, or from a consulting perspective, I suppose consulting perspective is a little bit different to, being present in the office, and that kind of, if we talk about that type of flexibility, employees are right. Well, actually, you know what? I've experienced this idea of flexibility. I know I can do my work in the hours that I've worked from home, and spend time at the kids' basketball game, or I do some washing in between. That kind of flexibility. So if that's not there, I've got kind of even more of a reason to start looking at other roles. And indeed, sort of that's around 53% of millennials and Gen Z are admitting that they're looking for new roles based because the structure or the culture is not worth it. So as organisations, we need to be super careful about that. I think the other thing we need to look very carefully about is how we support sort of that mid-level managers, right? Because they feel sort of that wedged in between the demands of leaders to say, hey, everybody needs to be at their desk Monday to Friday and have to be there, and then employees going, hey, I can do everything from remotely, so why can't I do that? And so managers are trying to find that that balance between those two. I think in doing that, leaders need to figure out a way to make the office commute make the commute to the office worthwhile, right? So, an example, like I sit here at home. I was contemplating on going into the office today for this session, but I'm like, you know what? Actually, I've got my 2 screens. I've got my video camera. All of this kind of stuff. I'm like, actually, you know what? So I'm going to do it from here, right? I have other reasons to be here, but you need to think about, well, how do we create a culture that will create that collaboration, that will encourage people to come in? I think flexibility also doesn't mean always on. And I think, that relates to the point we were just talking about with Claudia, right? Is that whole idea of we really, really need to be careful, because we have flipped the other way, and we have a big challenge here at Microsoft around that kind of always on culture, and that's being connected to flexibility. It doesn't, and we need to figure out respect. And I think the last point of the 5 is really around that rebuilding that social capital that we've lost as we've been there, right? I do a lot of work with our corporate team, our engineering team. I'm part of a corporate team, and I haven't met a lot of them, and a lot of them don't have that level of trust in me in terms of, oh yeah, hey, I'm going to do that for you because I know you, right? I know you from meeting you and just, having a drink with you or whatever we're doing. That kind of thing is missing. So how do we bring that back in? So yeah, there's some important trends that are there that we really need to think about as we move into the next year, and think about how do we look at flexibility? How do we look at kind of I kind of don't want to call it hybrid work, because it is all about flexibility really, although the theme of the report is making hybrid work.
And Carly, do you have any other sort of interesting examples about how Microsoft is tackling that from a perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a whole range of things that we do, right? I was the one who put the team agreement in the mentee thing. So we have agreements with teams to say, between the hours of 10 and 2 on a Wednesday, right? That's when our team is coming in. We've got our team meeting at this time. We want everybody to be in that room to create connections, but we're not requiring you to be there for the full day, right? But we would like you to be there. And so that team agreement's also with managers as well. And so having that agreement with managers, because if my manager leaves and I don't have a written agreement, then my new manager can kind of go, oh no, well, I don't care about that. But having that written agreement as well. Things like, connecting people through, the likes of technology. So Viva technology, right, to support communications and through management. So management are aware of people's responses, right? We do the employee signals survey, which is through Glint. We do listening using employee listening technology. So we utilize, as I mentioned, Glint, but we also look at Viva Insights capability to understand what's happening. We have model coach care is like our management ethos, really around how to support our managers, and we support them with data and training and things like that. We've got, hybrid meeting etiquette. We've got sort of etiquette that comes out to says this is how we should be doing meetings, and making it inclusive, because the worst thing is if everybody's in the desk and one person's on the phone or coming in, that can be really, exclude people. What else have we got? Just things like using focus time for team focus time, right? Getting that quality work, that we're not just busy with busy sort of stuff, really focusing on time to learn, to create sort of space for innovation, things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we're trying to do to connect people to understand the behaviours that are happening in the organisation. But I think the key to all of this for us is data, having that data from various different places, from that Glint to that employee signals, that active listening versus the passive listening is super important to us, and how we work and how we support our managers.
There's so many great examples there. I'm hoping the people in today's session are probably madly taking notes to hear that sort of insider Microsoft perspective. On that point about leaders as well, Laurie, just to bring you into the conversation as well, I know you've been doing some analysis around those collaboration habits of leaders. So with that sort of benchmarking that you're running right now, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about what you are finding.
Sure, Emily. I was pleased to hear Claudia's comment about bad habits and monitoring those and identifying those. Of course, when we released our SWOOP M365 product, it was centered on habits that we'd sort of observed and measured in our previous benchmarking studies. And thankfully, some of the habits, like things like email liberation, we call it, people that sort of are stuck in email. Our asynchronous worker is pretty much people that don't rely on face-to-face meetings for everything. The chat liberation, being stuck in the whole telephony sort of thing with chat and calls and meetings and so forth. And you'll see there's 7 habits we designed, I guess, to measure people's behaviours. Now we actually SWOOP, when we benchmark, we measure what people do. So if you like, it's like what Kayla was calling the listening. We sort of analyse how people are working. So it's not a survey. So in fact, we believe that we capture a lot of the practices from people that normally wouldn't respond to a survey, right? So, and we're seeing a lot of things. We're seeing a lot of insights there that we really didn't expect. And one of the things we looked at was with leaders is that we actually were able to identify. I mean, currently we've got 18 organisations, well over 100,000 staff. So it's quite a large sample of workers, digital workers. A good proportion of those were able to identify what their role was. So we could use sort of our analysis could pick the roles that were clearly managerial, and then we tried to look at what are their digital behaviours like compared to the non-leaders. Now, I guess the research is telling us that, managers, and I think we heard this from both of you, are really stressed at the moment because, they grew up in the office. They could visually monitor people's, if you like, hours in the office. But once we went remote, that disappeared all of a sudden. And we heard stories about how they were struggling because before they could engage face to face, but now they're in a digital world. And, and I guess what we're hearing is that managers really weren't that good on digital because, they didn't have to be. They could just walk around the office. That was certainly the hypothesis that I took in. But thankfully, what we found was that those leaders were actually performing across all the habits better than the non-leaders. In fact, I think the score was something like 66%. We have ratings between 0 and 100. So they averaged around 66 compared to around 53 for the non-leaders. So clearly they're doing a good job at becoming better at working digitally. And I think that was something that surprised me, if you like, but it was very positive. The other thing we hear talked about a lot is this one-on-one engagement. I know a lot of the Viva Insights work has been looking at that line manager to employee sort of relationship and the one-on-one calls that you would have face-to-face in the office, but when you're remote, how do you get that one-on-one engagement? So we did look at one of the factors that we measure is participation in one-on-one calls, and surprisingly found that with the non-leaders, nearly 40% of those hadn't been in a one-on-one call in 6 months. Right now, you might say, well, maybe they met face-to-face because we don't pick that up, but we're looking at a period where people were still largely remote. So that was a significant number of people that hadn't even taken one-on-one call. And even with the leaders, some like 18% of those hadn't been involved in a one-on-one call, according to the data that we're capturing. Now, as I said, there may be some leakage with face-to-face and so forth, but that tells you something about, this lack of one-on-one. They might have participated in meetings and so forth, but this particular measure is on one-on-one calls. So I think there is something there that we need to be aware of. The other thing
Laurie, Can I just add to that? I think the one-on-one calls are very important, as I mentioned, in terms of our managers and our model coach care, and we do look at that data. But what we're looking at is that considered time that's set aside for that one-on-one meeting, not just a random kind of connection. So I think, you know, where people kind of go, well, we did connect, we did have, you know, we did meet, you know, for at the water cooler. All of those things aren't kind of dedicated one-on-one times. I mean, it may be that you met one-on-one, but it isn't kind of that regular scheduled catch up. I know I can talk to my manager about my pressures or my concerns. And so that's where we're looking at that data, right? Super importantly, is it's not just about the connection itself. That's a whole other thing that we can look at from a network perspective. But have you taken that time, that regular time slot and dedicated time and putting that value in that relationship and with that connection to be able to help that out? And the research shows, right, when you have that dedicated time between a manager and employee, that can really help with things like, you know, your networks or your pressures that you have in terms of your workload. All of that kind of stuff can then be, you know, a part of that conversation. You know, what can I do to take things away? So yeah, I'd agree. Like it's really important to consider that as part of the whole equation.
Absolutely, and I guess what the data is telling us is that it can't be happening. So if you haven't been on a call at all, then clearly you haven't had a call with your manager. So that's scary, I think, and that's something that and we see that we're calling it the long tail. These are the people that really don't sort of participate, wouldn't surface in a survey or anything like that. There is a long tail of people that really aren't that active digitally, right? So I think we've got some data that we looked at the time people spent in a synchronous activity, like say whether it's a call or a meeting, of all the time that was spent that we analysed, sort of the busiest 10% took up 42% of all of that time, and the least busy, like the bottom 50%, only accounted for 6% of the time. Right now, we worry about the busiest 10%, and of course, there's been a lot of focus on those, and rightly so, because they're nearly overusing the technology, and they're the managers, often the managers that are stressing. But we've got this really long tail that just aren't doing much at all. Right now, you know, if we think back to Amazon and how they mine the long tail, this is the same story with digital work, right? So what you find with that the distribution of digital work is that you're going to have this group that are hugely overachieving, if you like, using it too much. But you're also going to have this big long tail of people that really aren't doing much at all, you know, and they're nearly invisible. And I think we need to shine a light on those, because you only have to bring some of those up, like the 40% of people that didn't have a one-on-one call, you know, sort of online in 6 months. You know, imagine if some of them just had, as Kaylee said, one call with their direct manager once every quarter even, that number would change significantly, right? So, you know, one of the themes that we certainly are pushing in this report is that we have a long tail of people that really just aren't that active digitally, right? We don't know what they're doing, actually. You know, they could be working on their documents or spreadsheets, but not sharing anything. We don't really know. But this is an opportunity, I think, for organisations to, you know, we're worried a lot about the people that are busiest, but, you know, in reality, that's 10% of the organisation. It might be an important 10%, but it is only 10%, right? So you've got the rest of the people. What about them? Who's studying them? You know, so I think there's a lot that we can do in this long tail. You know, it's the same sort of thing that Amazon discovered with books, you know, sort of there's a lot in there, but they're sort of invisible. So we want to bring those people into the light and say, well, how do we move these people that really just aren't digitally active at all into the game, right? So, and that's going to have to happen if we're going to succeed. So I guess that's I guess the main points that we've come out of. I think some of the other numbers that we saw was that we see that asynchronous work, of course, a lot of people are using chat to replace email. We think that's a bad idea. We don't think chat's discoverable, that people can actually, you know, if you have a new starter, how are they going to find out what your team's been doing? They can't really just trawl the chat. You know, we certainly see that Teams channels is incredibly underutilized, right? So we see that the Teams channels, and Yammer, of course, as well. So when we look at Yammer and Teams channels, which are the main modes for working asynchronously, you know, 58% of the over 100,000 people that we analysed hadn't done one Yammer post, like, or channel message, right? So you can understand why people are getting overloaded with just meetings and chat, and mainly it's a lot of it is chat. because they haven't actually even joined the game in terms of working asynchronously there. In fact, we were able to look at each of our habits. We were able to look at the variation, and Claudia talked about the lack of norms. You know, asynchronous working, which is really meetings, the telephony, favouring telephony over anything asynchronous, is by far the biggest variation that we saw. The next one was email, which is not surprising. So the top two the biggest variety in the variations in how people work were in asynchronous working. This is the telephony versus asynchronous work, and being stuck in email, you know, and that was pretty closely followed by being stuck in chat, right? So these are the things we worry about, and we're worrying about them because, you know, the huge variation in practices, and we've really got to bring that variation in to actually start to become productive, right? Now, you'd be interested in the fact that one of the lowest variations were in things like turning your camera on. So we've got the camera on now. As it turns out, we talk a lot about having the camera on or off, but most people are pretty good with that, right? It's something that, you know, it's something that you probably wouldn't have to prioritize as much as, you know, worrying about people working asynchronously versus being stuck in the telephony and things like that. So, yeah, I describe it as, you know, it's a little bit like the Wild West at the moment, digital working. You know, there's just such a big variety, but at the same time, such an opportunity to do something great with this new way of working. You know, but you know, as we've all said here, we've got to start monitoring. We've got to start measuring. You know, we've got to start analysing. The data is there to be able to do that. You know, we've had a wonderful 2 years where people have been, for an analyst like me, been stuck at home. You know, we're not, you know, the analysis isn't sort of polluted, if you like, by face-to-face. We've got the whole digital picture, if you like, so we can learn a lot, as Microsoft has, about how people are working in this last couple of years. But as we move into, you know, some in the office and some not, you know, that style of work, you know, we're going to have to, you know, it is a complex situation. And the way we deal with complexity is measuring, analysing, monitoring, you know, reinforcing the good and dampening the bad. And this is what we're going to have to do over the next couple of years.
I think to add to that, I just want to put a kind of side note to this is really thinking, you know, particularly on that camera, no camera, and, you know, team meeting coming in and things like that, is really making sure you put an inclusivity lens on this whole scenario too. Is thinking about particularly with cameras on, is to give people permission, or, you know, have some sort of a foundation of agreement as to what's expected, and to give that inclusivity. So for people on the spectrum, for example, you know, they may not feel comfortable. So maybe it's cameras off unless you're asking a question or responding. So I know that in some meetings, the theme is like everybody has their camera off, but, you know, whenever I'm speaking, I always turn my camera on because I feel uncomfortable about being the only person on the screen. But thinking about the impacts of that, because I think at the start of the pandemic, if we talked about flexibility, and, you know, you didn't think about the people who wanted to come back into the office because they're in an abusive situation at home, or I'm here with like 5 other graduates who are working for competitive companies. And so you really need to think about this diverse perspective of people and that level of inclusivity when you start to create the foundations of policy. Because I think, you know, I agree, Laurie, it's a bit Wild West at the moment, and everybody's kind of jostling in to kind of understand what works for them in their culture. And it's going to take a while to settle down as we, you know, we're doing the same, right? Test, figure out if that's good, look at the insights, change, test, figure out the insights. You know, we're doing that kind of virtuous cycle until, you know, I think we'll always be looking at it. But I think that's really important to look at it from an inclusivity and a diversity kind of lens as well. When we're looking at hybrid work, one size will not fit all. Neither does working in the office as it used to be fit all. But how do we make that the best scenario for everyone?
Thank you, esteemed panel. I think we would love to get into some more sort of practical tips as well, just conscious of time, getting towards the end of this session. Let's get into some of the juicy stuff about how we can actually make this shift and make that change. So we've sort of established those challenges, we've talked to the research and what this actually looks like. So Claudia, I'm wondering if you can maybe talk through this a little bit. How can you start to change the culture to be more outcomes based. And to bring it back to that Star Wars theme, like maybe how can we be a bit more like Yoda?
So I think it comes back to the three themes that I mentioned earlier. So if you really focus on addressing, and I'll give you some examples, technology, understanding what's stopping your people, and also looking at your leaders, then you can definitely be more like Yoda. So first with technology, giving an example from Engage Squared, we are focusing on back to basics at the moment. So not necessarily for us anyway, focusing on proficiency of tech use, but just going back to basics and reminding ourselves of what's important from a process perspective, so that we're all aligned in terms of ways of working, and what tools we're using to communicate with each other, to just stop some of that friction from happening in our day. So for organisations on the call, I'd suggest maybe even for yourselves going back to look at what your basics are and how that translates into a virtual world. Make sure your people understand what features and functionality is there and how it fits into common work practices. So, for example, yesterday again on the same workshop, someone said, I'm pretty sure this person doesn't know how to use Scheduling Assistant because I keep getting invitations for meetings when I'm already double booked or triple booked. So not booking over people's focus time unless you've checked in with them first, respecting the status, all of these really simple things, but they're hugely powerful in a virtual setting. I think we forget, and someone mentioned in the chat that we've lost some of our like some of the common courtesy or the humanity that comes with being physically together. Usually if I see, Ruby, who's one of my colleagues, at her desk, if I need to go and ask her a question, I'll kind of pause and just check, is she actually really busy? Should I interrupt her now? That's gone when you're in a hybrid world because we can't see what's on that person's plate. So even if they're green, their status is green, doesn't mean that they're free and waiting for your call. So I think going back to basics and looking at how you use technology is really important. The second is putting in some time to understand what's actually stopping your people from achieving their goals. So are they stuck in busy work? Do they understand and have visibility of company objectives? Do they understand how their individual objectives feed into those larger company goals? Are they struggling with a lack of consistency in ways of working? Looking at all of these questions and getting answers to them by talking to your people will really help you create that clarity around virtual collaboration and also establishing new norms. And that's where obviously having those signals from things like SWOOP and also Viva Insights is really, really important to feed into that conversation. And then lastly, coach your leaders. So they're the ones that are having the most influence on the behaviour of your team. So make sure you spend time creating new norms with them and training them on how to use technology in healthy and sustainable ways, so then they can walk the walk with their staff. In terms of who you should work with on these types of initiatives, this is really a company-wide challenge. It's not up to just technology to solve it. Likewise, it's not up to just HR to solve it. It really does need to be a joint conversation, and one that includes a voice from the executive leadership team as well. So there's that real sponsorship right from the top to introduce new norms and really change culture. So make sure you have the right listening tools and make sure you focus on those three things: coaching your leaders, understanding what's stopping your people, and going back to basics with technology use. They would probably be my practical tips to share.
Thanks, Claudia. And Carly, what are some of the, I know you touched on this briefly before, but what are some of those Microsoft tools that can help leaders with measuring outcomes as well?
Yeah, and I definitely alluded to it before. Well, no, I think I was pretty obvious about it before, right? Those listening systems like Glint and like Viva Insights, for example, really we use that data across the organisation in terms of that collaboration metrics from from emails, from Teams interactions, etc., to provide our managers and our leaders with insights to make insights-based decisions. And I think you can only go so far with kind of the employee surveys, which is really that subjective kind of assessment. and that active listening, right? It requires people to actually complete the survey and take time out of their job. So really augmenting that anecdotal evidence with kind of that hard data that shows you what people are doing, right? Like the SWOOP analytics as well. The other thing to consider is things like, you know, if you're looking from an objectives perspective, is looking at something like OKR tools. So we acquired Ally.io last year, and we're hoping to make an announcement about how it's being a part of the Viva modules coming very soon. So that tool, a lot of organizations have been doing, you know, keeping track of their objectives and key results, right? How do things connect back to my strategy? And having a real-time view of that. A lot of that hasn't been real-time because it's kept in spreadsheets, and people are having to track that right up to management, right? How are we tracking against these organisational goals as individuals? And so the OKR tools is something that we use as well to inform our leadership at real time. Anytime we can see sort of where we're tracking in terms of our organisational goals. So if we want to become more outcomes-based, well, that's one of the ways to drive it, right? To see the progress there. So yeah, so that's kind of a couple of the things from my point of view.
Thanks, Carly. And I also couldn't resist the opportunity to bring in our Princess Leia 2.0. We've got Kai there on the call. Kai,
the ginger Leia.
Yes. Kai, maybe if you could also just give us a bit of insight on the SWOOP tools that are available as well to measure those outcomes too.
Yeah, let me just start by apologizing to Claudia. We hadn't done a costume sort of alignment workshop before this.
It didn't even save glasses. What's going on?
This is a very, very sad version of Princess Leia compared to Claudia, so for which I truly apologize. Just touching on the leadership perspective, I think that with everyone sort of considering how to move back into the offices, I think there are two key challenges for leaders. Even though it's very, very optimistic and positive what Laurie was saying about 66% that the score, the collaboration habits are stronger on leaders than non-leaders, there's a real risk if the top executives are not leading by example. They kind of drag, you know what I mean when I say drag everyone down. If you have a very senior boss who's insisting on receiving and sending emails and will never ever go into Teams, then the rest of the companies will find it difficult to then work around that. So I think from an executive level, there is a very important part of that. And what we are trying to do with for M365 is put some light on those really good collaboration habits, and especially in how people are using those tools. It strikes me as, if you really want to work smart digitally today, you can't just be working in email. It's just saying that's email is the only thing that I'm doing. Just it's not the way of the future. There's so many studies about the ineffectiveness of email, and you all recall that. We all said that for the last 5-10 years that we don't want to be sort of dragged down by email because it's not the best. It's not a good project management tool. It's not a good communication tool. There are many things it's not good at. And now that we have M365, there's a suite of things, and we just need to find out how we balance the use of these tools. And I think that's the key role that we can play, is helping us understand the balance in which we're using the tool. I don't think anyone is going to think that email is going to die tomorrow, not at all. But it just can't be the way of the future that we got so many people, as Laurie was saying, that there's such a long tail of people that have not found a better use of these tools. So Claudia, your point about back to basics, I think is so fundamentally important, because all of us that are in technology roles, I mean, it's hard, isn't it, to go back and remember what it's like. When at a conference recently, I heard someone got so excited about the fact that they've taught someone how to send a link to OneDrive, and I went, honestly, like, is that really where we are? But that's where a lot of people are. We should never ever forget that just getting people to send links rather than attachments is a good thing. Can we get them onto online meetings? Even better. But we have a long tail of people that are still finding their way in this, and that's probably from an ROI perspective the biggest opportunity we have. We've done ROI calculations of getting people using just a little bit less email. We're talking about 1 email less per day and moving it into channels or into Yammer. 1 email, saving about 11 minutes per person per day. Now think about when you start to add this up per week, per month, and you multiply it by 1,000 or 10,000 employees. It's millions and millions of dollars in employee cost that could be spent better doing more useful things. So it is really about doing that little bit of that boring, you know what I mean? Boring lifting of, back to basics, always remembering that we have to do these gradual small improvements in collaboration habits. And as Laurie is pointing out, that little bit of data that helps us understand how far we come that path helps us just celebrate success when we get there. It helps us target education training programs for those that where we have the greatest opportunity to help them.
Thank you. And we are sort of getting towards the end of the session and, being respectful of people's time as well. So just before I sort of get some final thoughts from the panel, I just wanted to share a few quick things that you might be interested in after joining today's session. So you would have heard Laurie talk to some of the insights from our upcoming SWOOP for M365 benchmarking report. So if you'd like to register to receive that report and really deep dive into those insights around leadership and sort of looking at some of those digital collaboration patterns across the board, I think that would be a really great resource for you to have access to. So I'll give you the opportunity to download that there. You can also just hop onto the SWOOP website if you'd like to. Claudia, do you want to just quickly chat about this part here?
Yes. So if you are struggling with ways of working in your organisation, or you want to know more about how you can use signaling tools, for example, the Viva Suite, please do get in touch. So use the QR code on the screen here. There are some Microsoft funded workshops that your organisation might be eligible for, so we can check that for you. Or if you just want to have an hour call with me or someone in the Engage Squared team about your organisation specifically, use that same form to get in touch.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Any other final thoughts from the panel on our overall topic, outcomes versus hours worked? I think we've surely nailed that discussion and given our attendees something to take back to the organisation. Anything final you'd like to add?
No, it was very enjoyable. And I see there's plenty in the chat, so
Yes.
Thank you, attendees.
Fantastic. Yes, of course. Thank you so much to everyone who got active in the chat. There's lots of great stuff in there. So thank you for coming along. Thank you so much, Carly, for coming along and providing those insights. And from the Microsoft perspective, Claudia, of course, from Engage Squared. Always love your practical tips and the ways that we can apply this in our own organizations. And of course, Laurie and Kai for some of those extra sort of benchmarking and leadership insights as well. Thanks everyone for joining. We've had a fantastic time. May the force be with you, or may the force be with you. And we'll see you at our next session. Thank you so much.